The man to die.
You want him to suffer?
Yes.
He killed her son, a young police officer, more than 12 years ago.
The actual execution. Do you understand how they're going to kill you? What they're going to do?
It's actually kind of sickening to me.
One mother eager for an execution, another praying it won't happen.
They are saying justice has been served, justice has been done. Whoop-de-doo.
What brought the two families to this tragic intersection?
Football player, track star. What happened?
Went astray, got lost.
And is there any way he could escape what so many believe is certain death?
He had nobody to come up and say that he had ever been a decent citizen.
And that seemed odd.
Yeah, it seemed very odd.
Tonight, John Larson goes to a world few people have seen, to the past, the present, and perhaps the future, with time running out for a man condemned to die.
If I could take your place, Patrick, I'd take your place.
Two families condemned to live in the shadow of the death penalty.
Dateline with Jane Pauley and Stone Phillips, plus Tom Brokaw, Katie Couric, and Maria Shriver. Dateline will continue after this brief message. From Studio 3B in Rockefeller Center, here is Stone Phillips.
Good evening. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. A law as old as the Bible resonates today in the 38 states that allow capital punishment. Death penalty cases have made big news lately. The trials of Terry Nichols and Timothy McVeigh for the Oklahoma City bombing, Theodore Kaczynski in the Unabomber case. But behind the headlines are the anguished and often angry people who grieve and then wait while the wheels of justice grind on for years. Tonight, an extraordinary inside look as two families await an execution that's been postponed 3 times. You'll hear from the family of the victim, the family of the killer, and the condemned man himself. Another date has been set. How will it end this time? The story now from John Larson.
It's a day that's been 12 years in the making, a day that never seems to arrive.
I'm anxious to get this over with.
If all goes as planned, a man will die here by lethal injection.
Regardless if they kill me or not, it'll never put an end to it. It's never a closure.
It is the day of reckoning for a convicted killer who says it took death row for him to love life. But this is also the story of 2 women at the mercy of an imperfect system whose lives were shattered in one murderous moment. One whose son was brutally killed can't wait to see the killer die.
I wished it could be the electric chair, the gas chamber.
This is the whole family?
The other woman, the mother of the condemned, says if she had known the suffering her children would cause, she would have done it all differently.
I wouldn't have had any at all if I could have foreseen the future.
Tonight, an extraordinary and painful 12-year journey to find closure, which begins on September 21st, 1985.
There's emergency. I'm sorry, but this is Bombs on Lamar.
It is Saturday morning in Paris, Texas, when a clerk from the ice cream store telephones police.
We have just been robbed at gunpoint.
The police call out all units.
Okay, got 2 black males, one's 5'7", one's 5'8".
23-year-old officer David Roberts hears the call on his car radio. A minute later, he sees the suspects, turns on his lights, and as police later showed us, quickly makes a U-turn. The suspects pull over. As Roberts stops his police cruiser behind the suspects, the driver, in front of at least a dozen witnesses, gets out and fires 1 shot through the windshield of the police car. This bullet hits Officer Roberts in the neck. The gunman then walks to the driver's side window, and using 2 hands, he empties his gun. 1 in the officer's chest, 1 under his left arm, 1 in his right arm, 1 in his chin. As Officer Roberts lies dying, the suspects speed away.
Well, I just come in.
In a cruel coincidence, Patsy Roberts is working as a volunteer at the hospital when she's asked to come to the emergency room. Her son David was dead.
There was my beautiful baby boy. laying there so pretty. He looked like he was at rest.
Across town, the police officer's wife, Pam, is asked to come to the hospital.
What goes through a heart or a mind at that point?
Well, I was 4 months pregnant at the time. You know, you just kind of go into shock.
News of the tragedy spread quickly throughout the policeman's family. David's older brother was also a police officer.
I'll never forget these words, and my aunt, all that she said was, Danny, David is dead.
100 miles away in Oklahoma City, a mother by the name of Patricia Rogers went to bed the night before wondering where her son Patrick was.
And he hadn't got home by 12 o'clock the next day. I was really getting worried.
36 hours later, her doorbell rang. It was a friend of the family with bad news.
And I said, what did they do? What did they do? And he said, the first thing he said, Patrick killed the cop. And I was just like, went down to the floor like, no, you gotta be kidding me.
Back in Texas, after an 8-hour run for their lives, 2 men gave up without a fight.
You come here this morning, broken, hurting.
At the funeral for Officer Roberts, hundreds came to say goodbye.
I've heard it said that the whole town was there. That's not an exaggeration.
No, the store shut down. People on the streets.
One city leader said, in a town this small, losing a police officer is like the assassination of a president. Across town, the suspects were held here in the Paris jail as charges mounted against them. One was Patrick Rogers, whose parents came to see him hoping it wasn't true.
And his father asked him, said, did you do this? And he dropped his head and said, yes.
As she listened to her son through the glass window, Pat Rogers was stunned. But her next thought was for the victim, Officer Roberts, and his family.
And my heart went out to the family, you know.
The Roberts?
Yes.
She asked a lady at the police station to mail a sympathy card to the Roberts.
She said, that's a very sweet thing to do. She said, and don't you blame yourself. And I felt so bad, you know. And I did cry. Because he had a baby on the way. And he never got a chance to see his baby.
David Roberts Jr. would be born 5 months after the murder of his father. But even David Jr.'s birth couldn't ease Patsy Roberts' pain. She wept at her son's grave every day for a year.
I would literally scream all the way home. I would just cry just as loud as I could cry.
6 months after his younger brother's death, Danny Roberts turned in his badge as a police officer. He's now a fireman, and time has not healed his wounds.
It's like somebody took my heart out of my chest, put it on the floor, and stomped on it, and put it back in that poor condition.
From the moment Officer David Roberts was gunned down, the Roberts felt justice required that the murderer, Patrick Rogers, be executed.
You hate Patrick Rogers?
Yes.
With every bone in your body, you hate him?
Yes.
Can you understand how someone would hate what Patrick did and want him executed?
Yeah, I can understand it.
Had it been your boy that was killed like that?
I don't think I would have wished nobody else to die, though. I really don't.
There would be a trial in which Rogers' attorney tried to explain what had happened. Rogers was high on drugs, he said, very high, temporarily insane. But the jury didn't buy it. They found Patrick Rogers guilty of murder and sentenced him to death. That was in 1986.
Happy birthday to you.
And in some ways, that's when this story begins. Because in 1997, the son of the slain policeman, who never knew his dad, turned 11 years old. While the man convicted of killing his father is kept alive on death row. But that soon could change. As one family prays for a miracle, the other hopes for emotional healing. And everyone involved begins a new year of pain and anger. You're about to see what life is like in the shadow of the death penalty.
Who's the man responsible for this tragedy? When we come back, Patrick Rogers.
From Studio 3B in New York, here is Jane Pauley.
Back to our story. 33-year-old Patrick Rogers has spent 11 years on death row for murdering a police officer. From the grieving family, there is no forgiveness. All they want is to see Rogers dead. But like all of the 3,200 people on death row nationwide, Patrick Rogers has a story. Once again, John Larson.
Death row, Huntsville, Texas, March 1997. Patrick Rogers' execution could be scheduled any day. Many here insist they're innocent. Rogers never has.
Did you kill Officer David Roberts?
I did.
You pulled the trigger?
I pulled the trigger.
Not once, but 6 times.
6 times.
Though he admits what he did, Rogers says he is not the killer who came to death row in 1986. Something happened to him here in segregation, the worst part of death row, which Rogers calls the lower level of hell. Over the years, Rogers says he sobered up, and without drugs, he found religion, Islam. He began writing, first poetry, then a children's story about the dangers of drug use. And perhaps most importantly, he began asking himself tough questions. Why had he killed a man? And what had happened to his boyhood dreams?
Wonder how many of your neighbors are still here.
1, 2, 3, 4.
According to his mother, her son grew up here in Oklahoma City in what appears to be a healthy family setting. They owned their own home, and her husband had a full-time job.
When you were 10 years old, what did life look like?
The Huxtables.
Patrick was the third of 6 children, and early on, his mother says, he was a typical fun-loving kid.
This is Patrick at his first prom.
What year did it come in?
His mother says trouble began about the same time the projects were built next to their neighborhood. Gangs moved in.
But gangs were not the primary problem here. People would later say there was no real structure or leadership in the family. No real values appear to have been established. And neither parent seemed much involved with any of their children. And to make matters worse, according to family and friends, Patrick's father, Gene Rogers Sr., who refused to acknowledge Dateline's telephone calls, used to beat his wife and kids. He broke Pat Rogers' nose. He broke one daughter's arm. And to discipline Patrick, he used to hold his son's head underwater.
As a result, several kids ran away from home. 4 dropped out of school, including Patrick, who quickly turned to drugs.
You know, I didn't see anything wrong with it then. And even if I had, I probably would have still did it again, you know, because I was young and daring.
Soon he was into hard drugs, cocaine and PCP. When Rogers was about 16, he came home one day so stoned that he staggered into the wrong house.
I said, what have you been doing? Mama, you name it and I've did it. I said, what in the God's name is happening? And I took him back in the bedroom and I started praying with him.
What were you praying for?
I was praying that God would deliver him from his drugs.
Patrick wasn't the only Rogers child using drugs. All 6 wound up hooked, so addicted that one child stole Pat Rogers' car and sold it to drug dealers for an extended fix.
They robbed me blind.
You told us you would literally go to sleep putting your money inside your bra.
And pitted it to me.
So that your own kids wouldn't take it from you?
Yeah.
Pat Rogers once dreamed all her children would find happiness, maybe even go to college. But instead, look what happened. In addition to her son Patrick, arrested 9 times for car theft, robbery, burglary, and currently on death row for killing a police officer, there's the rest of her family. A daughter arrested 11 times, convicted twice for possession of cocaine. A son arrested 3 times, currently in prison for aggravated assault with a gun. Another daughter arrested 3 times, also convicted for possession of cocaine and for shoplifting. Another son arrested 7 times is now in prison for theft and drug convictions. And her oldest son, who after serving 15 years in prison for armed robbery,
He doesn't have a headstone or anything, so it's kind of hard to find.
was shot and killed by a policeman during an attempted robbery.
145, here's my baby right here.
He lies buried here. No headstone, just a number.
Never thought in 3 years I'd be coming to see one of my children on here. Always thought it would be me they'd be coming to see. Then pretty soon I'll be having two.
Patrick says there were many reasons his family was falling apart, and drugs was perhaps the most destructive.
The more you do drugs, it kind of chips away at the base of what your principles were founded on.
Doesn't happen overnight.
It doesn't happen overnight, no. And you can feel yourself sinking.
Sinking into a life of drugs and crime. Rogers says he cannot explain the shooting. He only knows that to get to that point took him years, years of slowly dying inside. So much so that at the moment he pulled the trigger, he felt absolutely nothing.
I had actually lost some type of respect for human life. And when you feel like your life means nothing, then the other people around you, you feel like their life may mean just as little as yours.
It's a long way of saying that at the time of the killing, it just didn't matter. It's like, so what if I kill him? So what if I die?
I was already dead.
Dateline was able to locate 4 of the jurors, and they told us the biggest reason they voted to sentence Rogers to death was due to a bad feeling they got from him in the courtroom.
Well, I didn't really see any remorse.
He didn't seem to be bothered by the fact that he took away a man's life.
It's like he just did not have any kind of a conscience whatsoever.
Was I supposed to come into the courtroom insane, crying?
There would have been plenty of reason. I think people would have understood.
It wouldn't have changed nothing.
Yeah, but I mean, why not try? You got one shot, right? I mean, you got to convince this jury to somehow let you live.
It took me years to really come to terms as to what exactly happened and what took place. I understood that someone's life had been took when I was in jail, but at the time it didn't mean nothing.
Maybe at that moment then, given what you've just said, the jury did the right thing. They not only found you guilty, which you were, but they said, execute him. He's as empty and as cold as they come.
That was then. This is now.
While Patrick Rogers thinks he now understands who he was and why he killed a man, that will soon be put to a test. Unless his approaching execution is called off, he will face his victims' loved ones in one defining moment of truth.
Next, while Patrick Rogers' attorneys fight for his life, his victim's family hopes they will fail.
Here again is Stone Phillips.
Returning to our story, capital murder cases involve the ugliest of crimes and the slowest kind of justice. 11 years after his sentencing, Patrick Rogers has been on death row about 2 years longer than the average inmate spends there. And his lawyers will tell you it wasn't just his crime that got him the death sentence. Once again, John Larson.
April 16th, an execution date is set. If it proceeds as scheduled, Patrick Rogers has 48 days to live. Rogers' lawyers have, over the years, managed to postpone his execution 3 times, but now there is little left to appeal. For the Roberts, the endless delays have only prolonged their suffering and left them unable to close the most painful chapter of their lives.
He's on death row, and in some small way, you are too. You've been sitting here waiting.
Yes. And I get these telephone calls that he's got another appeal. That just does something to you. You just want to scream and holler and do all kinds of things because he's got another chance.
But did Rogers ever have much of a chance of avoiding the death penalty? If you ask the jurors, they thought if they gave Rogers life in prison, he might get out on parole. Texas does not have life in prison without parole.
So that was weighing on your mind?
Very much so.
He could get out. Life doesn't mean life.
Right.
Now, if that judge could have said to you, no, you lock him up for life, he'll never get out, would that have made a difference to you?
If we could have been assured beyond the shadow of a doubt that he would not ever get out of prison, sure.
And if you ask his current lawyers whether Rogers ever had a chance to avoid the death penalty, they say the problem started with his original court-appointed attorney, David Holmes, who they believe failed in the most basic sense to defend his client. Appeal lawyer Susan Carmanian.
And it was the picture of Patrick as a human being that was never presented to the jury, and that's where the greatest error, we think, came about.
For example, at sentencing, with Rogers' life in the balance, prosecutor Carrie Ashmore lined up 18 witnesses to show how Rogers had gone from bad to worse and would likely kill again.
He's an armed robber, car thief, drug addict, he's killed a police officer, okay? That's a pretty good predictor to me.
But when it was David Holmes' turn to call witnesses who could offer a sympathetic picture of Rogers, he called not dozens, not 3 or 4, he called none.
There was no preacher, there was no family people. He had nobody to come up and say that he had ever been a decent citizen.
And that seemed odd.
Yeah, it seemed very odd, especially if you've got the death sentence looking at you.
My investigators who went to Oklahoma City found nobody who was willing to get in a car and come to McKinney, Texas, and talk about what a nice guy Patrick Rogers was.
Maybe, but David Holmes' investigator, on a budget of only $500, went to Oklahoma for only 2 days, and that was during the Christmas holiday.
It was snowing, and he couldn't get into the schools, and he couldn't do the kind of research we think he needed.
But when Carmanian's team went to Oklahoma in 1990, they found dozens of people who say they would have testified for Patrick Rogers if they'd been asked. Holmes' response, it's easy to come forward after all is said and done.
Years after the trial, they're not going to be called as witnesses. They're not going to have to get up and actually testify. In a capital murder case, showtime is showtime. I mean, when the trial's going on, that's the time.
Still, one reason Holmes' search for witnesses was limited was a lack of money. The prosecution's budget for the case was $125,000. The defense's budget, only $10,000. According to a report done for the State Bar of Texas, this case illustrates what happens in so many death penalty cases involving court-appointed lawyers in Texas. They found a total lack of funds for representation of indigents, a problem recruiting qualified attorneys, and summarized the situation as desperate. And then there was the problem with an expert witness. Dr. James Grigson testified Rogers was a severe sociopath and guaranteed that once people like Rogers kill, they will kill again. But by the 1990s, Dr. Grigson, known as Dr. Death for having testified in more than 100 death penalty trials, caught the attention of the American Psychiatric Association. They labeled Grigson's so-called guarantees quackery and expelled him from their organization. Nonetheless, Grigson still testifies in Texas death penalty cases.
And there's more. When the jury had to decide whether to sentence Patrick Rogers to life in prison or death, the judge told them they could only consider Rogers' claim that he was high on drugs if they believed he was temporarily insane. And the jury had already rejected that argument when they found him guilty. But since then, the law has changed. If the trial were held today, the jury would be told they must consider any evidence which might cause them to spare a defendant's life.
And finally, there's the issue of race. Rogers' appeal lawyers thought it unfair that his jury consisted of 1 Hispanic and 11 whites.
What do you remember walking in the door that day?
Just a bunch of white people was ready to kill a black man.
Patrick Rogers also believes racism played a role, and not only in his trial. Racism, he says, helps destroy black families, and too often, young men like himself.
In America, everything's about race.
Everything?
Everything.
The fact that you pulled the trigger on a white policeman, was that about race?
Nope.
But in truth, Rogers' sentence may have less to do with the color of his skin than his victim's uniform. Since 1977, anyone in Texas, black, white, or Hispanic, convicted of killing a policeman was given the death penalty. Nonetheless, Rogers' appeal lawyers took his case to court after court after court, to 5 courts and before 18 judges, but not one was persuaded to give him a new trial. The prosecutor's take on it, second-guessing David Holmes is like playing Monday morning quarterback.
When the defendant again gets on the stand and says, yes, I steal cars, yes, I've robbed people, yes, I've done this, yes, I've used drugs, I buy drugs every day, yes, probation doesn't mean anything to me, no, I haven't ever learned my lesson, that lawyer, no matter how capable, no matter how well financed, can't change those facts.
And forgotten in the 11 years the case has been on appeal is the victim's family, the Roberts, who have learned that the death penalty can take its own victims. Endless appeals postpone the natural grieving process. Living in the lengthening shadow of an on-again, off-again execution, anger grows and hatred deepens.
I don't like to admit this, but I think about him every day as long as he is alive. I think about him living off of my tax money, eating 3 meals a day that my brother no longer gets, getting to watch television, socialize.
This is interpreted.
And the Roberts are angry at the appeal lawyers, who for 7 years lost every single decision, but kept appealing.
In the eyes of the Roberts family, you guys, the appeals lawyers, are the devil incarnate. You're the ones who put off this execution month after month, year after year. What do you say to them?
That this is the price that needs to be paid to make sure that people's constitutional rights are being protected.
You better hang on.
But of course, those who hurt the most pay much of that price. The Roberts family, even Patrick Rogers' mother.
What's it been like this 12 years?
Per hell.
Waiting.
Waiting.
Do you wish they had executed him the first year?
Right off and just got it over with.
Seriously?
Yeah. Can you imagine how hard it is on me?
But last spring, something happened in Texas that would suddenly result in an assembly line of executions. For the Roberts, it meant that justice might finally be done. For Patrick Rogers, it looked like his time on earth was about to run out.
When we come back, execution day approaches.
Returning to our story, Patrick Rogers' execution is fast approaching. Even with the odds against them, his attorneys are trying for one more delay. Will they succeed? Again, John Larson.
Come on.
In the long wait for Patrick Rogers' execution, Patsy Roberts has imagined him apologizing to her before he died.
If you could say something to him, what would you say?
Why did you do it? Why did you put 6 bullets into my baby? Come on.
Patsy Roberts' fantasy could come true. Last year, the Texas legislature passed a law allowing the families of victims to watch executions if they want to. Patsy decided if Rogers is executed, she wants to see it.
Watching Patrick Rogers die, is it about justice or is it about revenge?
Well, maybe a little bit of both.
You think you'll feel better
Yes.
seeing him die?
Yes, I really do.
Or sickened?
No, I think I'll feel better. Now, I may be wrong, because I've never done anything like this before. But I'll think, well, he finally got his.
And from the beginning, Patsy has felt Rogers will have it easy, dying by lethal injection.
I wished it could be something even worse than the legal injection. I wished it could be the electric chair, the gas chamber.
You want him to suffer?
Yes, I want him to suffer.
Her son Danny feels exactly the same way.
I somewhat think that if you kill someone, you should perhaps die the way you made them die.
And like his mother, he too says he needs to see Patrick Rogers die.
What would you get out of it that you wouldn't get from a telephone call?
It's just something about having a mental picture of him taking his last breath.
Patrick Rogers is scheduled to die here in what's known as the death house. With his execution imminent, he's having trouble coping with the prospect of his death.
The actual execution, do you understand how they're going to kill you? What they're going to do?
Yes. It's actually kind of sickening to me, so I get emotional when I talk about it, so I choose not to talk about it.
If it happens, Rogers will not see the drugs that will kill him. The warden will take off his glasses, a silent signal to begin the deadly dose.
As you know, the Roberts family has asked to see your execution.
True.
What does that make you feel?
It makes me think back on the old gladiator days, the old Christian days, where everybody was bloodthirsty.
They say that somehow seeing you executed will help them get on with their life.
But in their hearts, if they just understand and realize that regardless if they kill me or not, it'll never put an end to it. It's never a closure. It's never a closure to when you lose someone you love.
Rogers has asked his mother not to come to his execution. It's not something he wants her to see. And she's angry that the Roberts want to watch.
They'll say, justice has been served, justice has been done. Whoop-de-doo. You know. They're gonna bring their son back, or their brother back?
Not surprisingly, Pat Rogers believes her son should serve a life sentence, but says he needed something long before he went to prison.
What do you do with a young man like Patrick? Addicted to drugs, carrying a gun, robbing places?
Help. He needs help.
People watching will say what he needed was you. What he needed was your husband. What he needed was a home where the rules were clear and the guidance was strong.
I'll tell you. He always had me. He always had me. Now, his father is a total different story.
But in her quieter moments, Pat Rogers blames herself for what has happened to her children.
I live with this guilt, like it was my fault. It was something I could have did, and I didn't do it. And I went over this and over this in my mind many a nights. And I try to pinpoint something. But I haven't come up with anything yet.
May 20th, Dallas. 2 weeks before Rogers is to be executed, his lawyers are desperate. They appeal to the Board of Pardons and Paroles and include a letter from Rogers. Quote, "I am no longer confused, miseducated, and full of self-hatred. The lack of respect I showed then, the courts show now." May 23rd, Paris, Texas. Carrie Ashmore fires off a response with letters from David Roberts' friends and family. "I beg, I plead that you carry out the death sentence," writes Patsy. And from David Roberts Jr., "My grandma cries all the time because she misses my daddy, and I'm sad too. Please let justice be served."
What I'm going to do right here is give you all some information.
That same day, Dan Guerra from Texas Victims Services prepares the Roberts for what they might see and warns them about a recent grisly execution.
He never closed his eyes. He never fell asleep. So what the family saw was him gasping for air and making some loud noises that surprised them because the speaker is right above you.
But Patsy Roberts is not intimidated.
I'm just wondering what his last statement would be, because during the trial, he didn't have any remorse.
You will have the opportunity to look them in the eye. Do you think you will?
Yeah.
You think you'll look at that?
Yeah, I know I will.
But the question is, what, if anything, will he say?
Have you ever apologized to him?
In my mind, 1,000,000 times. What I would say if I had the opportunity to have him sitting in front of me, I already know what I would say.
Next, June 2nd, execution day.
From our studios in New York, here again is Stone Phillips.
Returning to our story, it's a day that's been 12 years in the making, and after all that time, two families in very different positions are still asking the same question. Will Patrick Rogers really be executed? As he faces the family of the man he killed, as they watch him, will there be anything close to understanding, apology, or even forgiveness? Once again, here's John Larson.
I'm anxious to get this over with.
June 2nd, 9 a.m.
Well, let's go to Huntsville.
Unless a stay is granted, the execution is at 6 o'clock tonight. The trip to the prison will take 4 hours. For much of the drive, the Roberts ride in silence, wondering if the execution will really happen. 2 p.m., Oklahoma City. Pat Rogers is home, trying to keep busy, knowing the execution is just 4 hours away.
He's still praying for a miracle.
He is informing the alternate jurors.
I still have time.
Because they were not in the courtroom when it was.
But a miracle is unlikely. In March, Texas began executing inmates at an unprecedented pace after a new Texas law went into effect limiting the number of times a death row inmate can appeal his own death sentence. Still, Rogers' attorneys haven't given up.
We faxed a letter to the governor's office yesterday requesting a 30-day reprieve. I have not heard anything yet.
Realistically, do you expect to?
No.
We went back to visit Rogers 5 days before his scheduled execution for what we thought might be the last time we would see him.
It's getting close. You holding out some hope?
I always have hope, just like I always have faith.
And clemency in cases like yours doesn't happen.
Clemency in Texas doesn't happen, period.
While he has yet to apologize to the Roberts, Rogers told us he hoped he would see David Roberts, the man he murdered, in heaven so he could say something to him.
Will it be kindness?
Definite.
Will it be asking for some forgiveness?
For understanding.
Will you say, I'm sorry?
Yeah. I realize the destruction and the pain I caused, man, in people's lives. It's nothing to be proud of.
We had visited Patrick Rogers 6 times, more than any family member or friend. When it came time for us to leave, Patrick Rogers began to cry.
I ain't too proud to cry. I'm not. I just tell y'all to keep y'all head up too, man. Keep your heads up and do what you gotta do.
To us, he was remorseful, even repentant. But what would he say to the Roberts?
Barring any last-minute appeals, Rogers is scheduled to die sometime after 6 p.m. today.
Welcome to Huntsville, Mother.
Mid-afternoon, the Roberts arrive in Huntsville.
Give Aiden a kiss.
3:30, a niece comes by Pat Rogers' house for support. And just in time, her day is about to get much more difficult.
Huh, your guess is as good as mine where your daddy is.
Her son about to be executed, Pat Rogers receives a call from her oldest daughter, who's just been arrested for drug possession. She wants anyone in the family to come bail her out.
Everybody's locked up.
At this moment, all 5 of her children are behind bars.
I feel like I'm going to take me some pills and just go on the tallest building and just jump off of it.
This is the way I feel right now.
3:45, back in Huntsville, as the Roberts prepare to go to the prison. Patsy fears the lawyers might somehow postpone the execution.
That would break your heart.
Just have a room ready at the nearest hospital. That's where I'll be.
4 o'clock, 2 hours before he is scheduled to die, Patrick Rogers calls his mother.
Hey, what's going on, stranger?
Hi. How you doing, baby?
I'm all right. How about you?
I'm all right.
Mother and son are allowed to speak for quite a while. Back in Huntsville,
Hi, I'm Danny Roberts.
Victim Services greets the Roberts as they arrive at the prison.
If I could take your place, Patrick, I'd take your place. I would, Patrick, I would. You have so much to offer.
Hello, Miss Roberts. I'm Elaine Smith. Nice to meet you. Hi.
In what may be his last conversation with his mother, Rogers tries to comfort her, thanking her for what she did right.
Who raised me? Who used to teach me how to cook? Who taught me?
I taught you how to cook.
Who taught me how to clean?
I did.
Katie, who taught me how to do it myself?
I did.
5:15, 45 minutes before the execution, Governor Bush's office calls to say Rogers' request for clemency has been denied. 5:58, the Roberts family is escorted to the execution building. Moments later, Rogers' lawyer, Susan Carmanian, is also taken to the death chamber. When the witnesses arrive, they see Patrick Rogers strapped on the gurney with an IV inserted in his arm. He is staring at the ceiling.
How I praise you.
6 p.m., the Rogers household. Relatives gather.
You are merciful and gentle, Lord. Slow in getting
6:03, Rogers is asked if he'd like to make a statement. He has not yet looked at the Roberts. His first 5 words, "I'll ask Allah for forgiveness." In Oklahoma City, Pat Rogers is restless. She notices the clock. Back in Texas, Rogers continues, quote, "To the brothers on the row, stay strong, peace." Patsy Roberts fears that if Rogers apologizes to her, she won't be able to watch him die. 6 feet away, he continues to stare at the ceiling and makes a statement that seems directed at the Roberts. Quote, "This is what they want to see. This is what they'll get. I bow to no man." 6:10 in Oklahoma, Pat Rogers can no longer bear it. As she cries, her son expresses his love for his mother and family and says to them, "Don't let these people break you with this madness." Patrick Rogers never apologizes to the Roberts. His last words were, "I'm finished." At which point, the man who brutally shot 23-year-old police officer David Roberts 6 times faces his own death. The drugs flow through the tubes. A few seconds pass. Rogers says, "Kinda bad, isn't it?" and gasps once. The prison doctor will wait 5 minutes before officially declaring Rogers dead. But 300 miles away, Pat Rogers, at that exact instant, senses what is happening.
He's already dead. He's already dead. He's already dead. He's already dead. Go away, go away.
Naturally, I would have liked to have seen him, I believe, suffer a little more than he did, because he just went to sleep.
In a press conference following the execution, the Roberts say Patrick Rogers' refusal to offer an explanation or an apology was, they thought, a sign of arrogance.
He did not show any remorse toward us whatsoever. He was concerned for Patrick Rogers and what was about to take place to him.
As Danny continues, this blue minivan leaves the prison, headed towards a local funeral home. It carries the body of Patrick Rogers. After 10 minutes of inconsolable grief, Pat Rogers' family helps her to her feet. It is a scene that the Roberts understand all too well, as Danny addresses in perhaps the most poignant statement of all.
To the family of Patrick Rogers, we know your pain. We hope that you know ours. As families, we have both lost.
In Paris, Texas, the next day, the headline, Day of Justice. And for Patsy Roberts, who waited 12 years, a difficult peace.
Baby, we finally got rid of that terrible killer that took you away from us. He finally got what's coming to him.
On Saturday, June 7th, Patrick Rogers was buried next to his brother. Various friends and family attended. His father did not. In the months we spent with everyone involved, we learned something happens in the shadow of the death penalty. Families focus on the execution and are frozen in time. The justice system, like the country itself, is at best conflicted. The years of appeals, a measurement of the court's ambivalence about executing a human being. And strangely, a violent young man grows up, understanding too late his role in this sad circle of death, yet unable or unwilling to apologize to those who most deserve to hear it.
You'll remember the jury called for the death penalty because it didn't want to see Patrick Rogers on the street in 20 years. Since then, Texas has changed its law. A life sentence for capital murder now means 40 years without parole. In 1997, the state led the nation in executions, putting 37 people to death. That's a record in Texas and nearly double the state's previous high, recorded back in 1935.